So today we're talking to John Henry Browne, who is a lawyer in Seattle, Washington, and is, I guess, very well known for representing a number of criminal defendants in our judicial system. The most famous being Ted Bundy, who, if you read John's book, is called The Devil's Defender: My Odyssey Through American Criminal Justice from Ted Bundy to the Kandahar Massacre. First of all, welcome, John, and thanks so much for coming on our podcast.
Sure.
So
be happy to.
Yeah. So, I'm sitting here in Chicago, and you're in Seattle, but in taking a look at the doing some research here, I saw that you originally grew up in Tennessee.
Well, I was born in Tennessee. My father worked for the Atomic Energy Commission. He was one of the first 10 members of the Manhattan Project. And so they built Oak Ridge, Tennessee out of nowhere. It was a high secret place. I was born there, and we lived there probably for less than a year. And then we moved to all the other places that were well known for the Manhattan Project, the University of Chicago, which is where it all started. Washington, D.C., Virginia, White Sands, New Mexico, Alamogordo, New Mexico. We moved 10 times before I was in the 10th grade.
You're almost like an army brat.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So yeah. Tell me about that. Tell me about that. Your upbringing, your folks.
Well, it was unusual. Everything was secret. I remember my father coming home on numerous occasions with briefcases handcuffed to his arm, which I always thought was kind of funny, but how would he take his clothes off? And he had a weapon. He was couriering, or being a courier for the Atomic Energy Commission, back and forth all over the country. There were very few things we could talk about at home about what my father was doing for a living. So it was, normally you come home and you say, "What'd you do today, Dad?" And I operated on 4 people, or I put in 4 fillings, or I represented 10 people in court. But with my dad, you just learn not to ask. So it was a bit distant of a relationship.
So how old were you when he retired from that job?
He was very successful at that until, we lived for a brief period of time in Cleveland, where my father had the best job he ever had out of the service. He was working and teaching at Case Western University, and he was also vice president of Tompkins Products, which was a big aerospace company. But because my mother had some illnesses from she was a child, and the cold weather in Cleveland was could have been fatal to her, so we moved from Cleveland to La Jolla, California, which was in those days Wonderland. And so he stopped working for the government when I was in the 4th grade.
So you were still a grade school kid when you were in California? Yes.
When I got to La Jolla, I was a 5th or 6th grader, and we stayed in La Jolla until I was graduated from junior high school, was president of my junior high school, all that kind of stuff. La Jolla was a very beautiful place back in those days. It's still a beautiful place. It's just unbelievably unaffordable now. Back then it was very beautiful, and rode my bike everywhere. I had lots of friends. My most favorite time in my youth was, and if you read my book, was when I lived in New Mexico and just wandered the desert on a daily basis with my dog, and discovered all kinds of the wonders of the world. And I'd say that my time in New Mexico was my favorite time as a child.
That's great. And so then where'd you move after junior high?
After junior high, we moved back to Palo Alto, California, Silicon Valley. And my dad was teaching part-time at Stanford and also was vice president of Bechtel, which was the biggest engineering corporation in the world. I think still is. It's certainly owned by private people. And he retired from there. And so I lived in La Jolla, in Palo Alto for my 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And that was a wonderful. Palo Alto was just wonderful. I was very lucky. And then Palo Alto became all boarded up and everybody thought it was going to go to hell. And then all of a sudden Silicon Valley started up, and now the house that we paid $37,000 for recently sold for $1.7 million. So.
Wow. So what high school did you end up going to?
Palo Alto High School.
Oh, wow.
Palo High.
How big a school was that?
Probably 2,000 students, very competitive. There's 2 high schools in the United States that usually compete for the best public high school, and one is New Trier High School right outside Chicago,
right,
and the other is Palo Alto High School. I mean, my classmates were all sons and daughters of Stanford professors, so it was a very interesting spot. Palo Alto was also the renaissance of many of the late 60s, early 70s movement. Our high school band was the Grateful Dead. They were known at the time as the Warlocks. And so our sock hops on Saturday night would be the Grateful Dead. 2 of the members of the Grateful Dead were above me 2 grades. 2 members of the Grateful Dead were below me in 2 grades. And I was quite good friends with him. And then if you read my book, you realize I went on to be a musician for a number of years and played with Jimi Hendrix and the Doors and the Grateful Dead and Big Brother and all that while I was in college. So
you actually, you said the Grateful Dead was your high school band. They actually went to your high school.
Yes. So did Joan Baez. So did Mimi Farina. So did a lot of Ken Kesey lived up on Skyline. I remember the day that Ken Kesey turned on Hell's Angels to LSD, and they came running down University Avenue, blasted out of their minds. I was there. I saw it all. Palo Alto was a very unusual place because it was so progressive. I didn't think there was such a thing as a young Republican until I went back east.
So you were the class of, was it 69 or?
No, I was not 65.
65, class 65. So you're class 65. The couple of Grateful Dead were graduated a couple years ahead in 63, and then some in 61 or 62.
Yeah.
Wow. And so then tell us about your musical experience.
Well, first of all, music has always been a savior to me. And I think particularly during this time in our lifetime, I have been, since this pandemic occurred, I've been sending out 1 song a day to about 100 people, and the list keeps growing. I'm fairly knowledgeable about music, and I've been getting a lot of good feedback on it. My musical experience began when I was in Denver going to college, and my roommate, who was my best friend from high school, had always had a band in Palo Alto that was a good band. And when he came to Denver, he wanted to start a band, and he couldn't find a bass player, and he came home one day with this really cheap Japanese Fender imitation bass and said, "You're going to be our bass player, and I'm going to teach you how." And 2 weeks later, we were playing on stage. And wow. then our managers ended up being the promoters for Jimi Hendrix and the Doors and Big Brother and any of the big groups that came to Denver. Our managers were the promoter of, so we were always the opening act.
And what was the name of
So,
your band?
the Crystal Palace Guard, which if you actually look it up on Google, it comes up with us playing with the Yardbirds, who Eric Clapton was in at the time. And I think the funniest part of my book actually is the times I had to babysit Jimi Hendrix for 2 days and babysit Jim Morrison for 2 days, which were very challenging experiences.
Was it easier or more difficult being a criminal defense lawyer?
I had to be more alert. Yeah, they were both very attracted to women in inappropriate ways, in my opinion. So I had to be protective of all my women friends, basically.
Okay, so then, so you got out of Palo Alto High, then you headed to Denver for college, and you spent
Correct.
4 years in college.
4 years, and
Where's that?
yeah, my dad was teaching at Stanford. I could have got into Stanford just because he was teaching. I did not want to stay in Palo Alto. I wanted to move. I was a skier. My dad asked around his professors and said, "What's a good school to go to if you have a nice son that's not terribly bright, but nice kid?" And they all suggested the University of Denver, which turned out to be a perfect fit for me. And I absolutely loved it and fell in love with Colorado and Denver and the whole scene.
That's great. And then, so what'd you major in?
Philosophy and religion, of course.
Nice, nice. I'm a history major, and I can't read enough books, and I love reading about our country, the country's history, and the world history. I love all that stuff.
Oh, I love history too. I chose philosophy and religion because I realized I could keep my class size smaller by doing that, and I always wanted to be in small classes, and so it was a great foundation, for sure.
Yeah, and so when did you figure out, hey, I want to be a lawyer?
Well, I never thought about it until I looked at my high school annual recently, and underneath my picture it says future lawyer, and I had no idea that I had put that in there. I really didn't.
Really?
I went to, I was going to be a rock and roll star, for God's sakes, and Jimi Hendrix was a friend of mine, so law was really not on the horizon until I got arrested in Denver, Colorado, for being very politically active. I started for a student for Democratic Society chapter. I was a member of CORE. I was a member of SNCC. I was the only white member of CORE. My roommate was black. We were on the hit list for the Denver police, not only because of our political activities, but because my band was corrupting the youth of Denver with our psychedelic rock. And so I got arrested for some bogus charge on 11 o'clock at night one time. And we had a band job that night. And obviously when you hear that jail doors sound, I'm not sure you've heard that, but it's a sound you will never forget. And basically I just started looking around and talked to the people that were there and realized that our system was taking advantage of these people. They were mostly poor and Hispanic and black. And I had a very wealthy girlfriend at the time, so I knew I could bail out quite quickly. But I decided to stay in for 3 days and just experience it. And that's when our band was about to sign a record contract with Elektra Records, which was the biggest record company in the time. And I pulled out of that and said, I'm going to law school.
So what did you said your dad said to his buddies, where do you send a not particularly bright kid that wants to ski? Do you really think your dad thought you weren't that bright?
We had a very complicated relationship. I mean, he's a nuclear physicist, for God's sake.
I get it.
And I had trouble doing algebra.
Yeah.
So it was a complicated relationship. I don't think I thought I was very intelligent until college, when I started to excel a lot. And then in law school, I was second in my class. And then I got a graduate degree after law school from the Ford Foundation at Northwestern, which was very prestigious. So then I started thinking, well, I probably am smart.
Yeah. How about your relationship with your mother? You had your dad with the briefcase with the handcuff around it. Tell us about your mom.
She was an angel. She was just really basically unconditional love, no question about it. Just basically, and she was very spiritual in the way that I am, and that she felt you can do anything that you want as long as you follow your path. And following my path was very important in my life and has been for a long time.
So your folks, where did they come from?
They both were from Staten Island, New York. My mother was born in Norway. My mother was a Rhodes she was a National Merit Scholar at Curtis High School in Staten Island, New York. Back in those days, you only had one National Merit Scholar per school. Wow. Now they have like 30.
Yeah.
And, I was there recently. I had some interviews I was doing in New York City, and I went to Palo Alto. To Staten Island, and I saw her plaque still in bronze up on the wall, which was really funny because my father was not a National Merit Scholar. So
really, no. Where's your dad from?
The same area, basically, Staten Island, New York. His father was a very wealthy young man, and they lost all their money in the stock exchange and fall. And my grandfather became a dock worker and told me he was the best thing that ever happened to him. And he and I probably became the best friends. He was my favorite relative of all, was my grandfather.
One of my favorite movies is that movie Cinderella Man. Did you ever see that?
Yeah, great movie.
And that reminds me of those workers, those dock workers, and that story. I love American success stories, and I love to know where people come from and all that type of stuff. So hearing the story about where your mom came from Norway, your dad is from Staten Island, and his dad's story. I love that stuff because I think that kind of shapes us a little bit, doesn't it? As far as who we become.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the whole nurture versus nature thing. And I think you're younger than I am, I think, but the children of the Depression and the Second World War, like my father, my father thought it was a sign of weakness to say you love somebody.
Right.
And I think that was true of that generation. My mother fortunately made up for that. And so, yeah, I mean, I had to fight that battle for a long time with my father, and finally came to rest with it. And he was, in many ways, he was a wonderful father. He provided well. I was in Palo Alto. Palo Alto was a very rich community, and I was one of the only students at Palo Alto High School that worked.
What was your first job?
Oh, very often I had 2 or 3 jobs, but it was usually working in sporting goods shops, very sophisticated sporting goods shops like Abercrombie and Fitch, and places where you could literally go and test the fly rod on the roof. And then I also worked in various other jobs. I worked at St. Michael's Alley, which was the famous coffee house where Ken Kesey and Allen Ginsberg used to hang out. And I thought these were just normal people, but these were the people I was around back in those days. So it's kind of skewed your view of what the world was like.
Well, so your dad, for lack of a better term, he's a physicist, he's a G-man, and his son becomes a fellow that takes on the man.
Oh yeah.
was your tell me how your father dealt with that?
Well, he said something which is I repeated in my book many times, and that is that he told me, particularly when I was becoming more well known, that he would say the quotes in the book exactly, and that is, if we're going to have a free society, we need people like you, and we need people who do what you do well, like you do. I'm just sorry it's you. And I actually came to believe that. I was interviewed once by the New York Times after something just not that long ago, and I was in a trial, and I was tired of a lot of these profiles, and Wall Street Journal, lost all over the place. But it was the New York Times, and so I threw my suitcase down on the couch, and the reporter said, "Well, why do you do this?" And I said, "Because it's my fucking path." And he said, "Well, that's not very romantic." And I said, "It's not. It's a really hard job. I don't recommend this job to a lot of people. I don't think people should do this job unless it is their path." I was told, by the way, that was the first time the New York Times put the word fucking on the front page. So
Nice. So I think I told you, before we started that, I'm one of 10 kids, and my dad is a social worker, and my mom stayed at home with us, and we ran out of money halfway through the month, every month, and so all of us had to get jobs, and so my sisters are all working hard. They all they work the jobs when they turn 16, and then they all migrated to where you're at now. They're almost all of them are in Seattle. My 98-year-old father lives in Seward Park with my sister.
Oh, I lived in Seward Park for a while. It's a lovely area.
Yeah. And so when I go to Seattle where you live, I love going back there. The food is amazing. And the people, it's good to be home, and I actually see mountains, because as you know, living in Chicago for however long you lived here, there's, the landfills are the biggest, mountains.
Yeah, well, I'm not a fan of Seattle at all. I don't know how the hell I ended up here. I think there's a lot of truth to the concept of the Seattle chill. I think there's very little culture in Seattle, and what culture there is Amazon culture, and it's changed a lot from when I moved here, where there was a lot of Native American culture, there was a lot of fishing culture, there was a lot of Scandinavian culture. Now it's just it's a very bland place. I wouldn't live here if I didn't have to. I don't know how a boy from the sands of New Mexico and the sands of Southern California end up in a place like this, and I can't stand it.
Well, where are you moving to?
Well, I have a house. I have a big house in Mexico, and it's a beautiful house, and I spend as much time down there as I can. I was going to be there now, but I can't leave because of the coronavirus.
Right.
So my eventual plan, I wrote a book, as you know, and it was more successful than anybody thought it was going to be. Certainly more successful than I thought it was going to be. It was on an Amazon bestseller list for a while.
Here it is, by the way, guys, just so everybody can look at it.
Yeah.
And
that's
a little
it.
bit longer hair in the picture there.
Yeah, that's true. It was a bad hair day. But I'm writing another book now.
And what's this one going to be about?
It's going to be fiction, kind of.
Oh, so you're going to play off some of the stuff that you've done?
Oh, probably. Yeah, I'm beginning to write it. And I like to write. I didn't know I was a good writer, but apparently that's published by Chicago Review Press, which is a fairly elite publishing company in Chicago. And so people think I can write, and I like to write. So I'm working on another book now, particularly with a shutdown. I can't do much else. I am practicing. I'm getting a lot of cases, which is interesting. I thought when this shutdown happened, business would completely dry up, and that's just not been the case. I think if people get in trouble now during this crisis, they kind of go to the first person's name they remember.
Right. And so tell me about that. So you have a law firm in Seattle?
Yes.
And
but I practice all over the place.
Okay, so if folks are in trouble in the United States, that's where you basically practice, right? United States?
Yeah, I practiced in most all of the Western states. I practiced in Chicago, of course, where I'm a member of the bar. I worked for Warren Wolfson and Sherman Magazine and Skip Andrew. I understand Warren became quite a good federal judge back there.
Yes.
His wife Joanne Wolfson was a good criminal defense attorney. I worked for the best attorneys in Chicago when I was there. Tried cases. That part of the book, I don't know if you've read it, but you'll get a kick out of it, about the bribery and the things that were going on in Chicago in those days. So I've tried cases all over. I just I just had a appellate appearance in the Supreme Court of a Military Appeals in Virginia 2 weeks ago. So kind of all over the place.
Yeah, and what is
mostly Western Washington?
Yeah, what's the in your opinion, are you in your prime right now?
I think the last trial I had, which was just 2 months ago, I tried. I told you, I tried 350 cases.
Yeah, I saw that.
Trials, which is, I don't know any lawyer that's tried that many trials. And I've won more than half of them. And to answer your question, I think the last trial I did was one of the best trials I ever did. There were some times in between 5 years ago and 6 months ago where I didn't think I did as well as I have in the past.
Right. So the one thing so I'm a lawyer that mainly handles cases involving money. Like I sue companies, insurance companies, that type of thing. And you mainly work defending folks that are accused by the state or the federal government of crimes.
Good.
What drew you to doing that?
Well, I've always been, I have the perfect job, the absolute perfect job for someone who's anti-authoritarian. And so I've always been anti-authoritarian. My father, to his credit, was, when he was younger, quite anti-authoritarian. I remember him standing up for one of his friends in the Atomic Energy Commission who was gay, and my father put his job on the line fighting for his friend and won that battle. My father was a delegate to the Kennedy Convention in 1960 or 62. So I've always been very suspicious of authority. And I become more so. And I mean, what's going on in the world today. I enjoy standing between an individual and the government very much. It's not easy. It's really hard, but I enjoy doing it. And I have seen some outrageous overreaching by the government time and time again, and it's getting worse, in my opinion, rather than better. So the job has become harder rather than easier.
One of the things that, that as we discussed, is that you and I are students of history. And one of the things that I've always felt is that one of the first things that the founders of our country enshrined was the right to a jury trial. And especially for, for somebody that's accused of a crime and can be confined, because the folks that were here had a lot of not having their rights held up. How well does a person like you need to understand the history of our country, the Constitution, and the various state constitutions?
How well does the jury understand that?
How well do the people like a person like you need to understand that to be able to explain to the jury what exactly you're doing?
It's extremely difficult. In some ways, then Seattle is also probably one of the most politically correct cities in the United States. It's been dubbed that way, I believe, by the U.S. News and World Report. I believe personally that political correctness is an illness. I consider myself one of the most politically correct people in the world, but I do not want to be told to be politically correct. Somebody who reviewed my book recently, who is quite famous, she's an actress in Hollywood, and you can probably figure it out if you read the review. And it said, one thing you can be certain of when you finish John Henry's book is he is a politically incorrect feminist. And I think that's a really good explanation of me. But going back to your question, it's, I recently, this case I won, which I really think I did one of the better jobs ever. It was a sting operation where there was really no victim, and people are being sent away for prison for 10 years for this stuff. And I actually went over the top, which I have been known to do, and told the jury that the government, and I always refer to the prosecutors as the government, is trying to use you as tools. They want to use you as a tool. And I had a jury that was full of a lot of ex-service members and some rural folks who I wasn't sure that was going to go over very well. But in talking to the jury afterwards, they were very persuaded by that. And so I think there's a spirit of individualism that resides within all of us. But drawing that out is very difficult.
Yeah, one of the, in my experience, one of the most important jobs as a trial lawyer, obviously, is preparing for the case. I mean, that's not, as you've written in your book, and I've heard interviews from you, is that you prepare, over-prepare, 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 so that when you enter the courtroom, you understand exactly what all the facts are, what the law is, and what every witness is going to say, and you've actually physically read every statement, etc. But one of the things that, in my experience, that is very important, there's a couple, there's obviously a lot of things as a trial lawyer, is when you select a jury, actually being able to talk to the jury and understand who they are as a person. Do you find that to be the case?
Yes. Sounds like tooting my horn a little bit, but the jury in this last case I won told me that I had won the trial during my voir dire. If you read my 10 rules of trial, one of the rules is no boilerplate. And when I say no boilerplate, I mean no boilerplate. And I don't think you should boilerplate a voir dire at all. These absurd prosecutors that ask, well, what newspaper do you read? Do you have a bumper sticker on the back of your car? All these absurd boilerplate questions that get you nowhere. And I could give you some anecdotes about that were very powerful.
I've read a lot of your interviews, and we're going to get to the questions about some of the clients that you've had famous. But I really like to know, and I think folks that hire a lawyer want to understand who they are as a person. But as far as the anecdotes about jury selection, if you could give a few, that'd be great.
Well, I think the most profound was a death penalty trial. My client was the trigger man in this very famous case. Matter of fact, I'm giving a speech about the case next week, and it was about the assassination of 13 Asian Americans who lived in Seattle and were participating in a gambling establishment. And the 13 of them were assassinated, basically, by my client and another client. My client has given me permission to speak about this, by the way, as have all my clients who are in the book. You know, in a death penalty case, you have to believe in the death penalty, otherwise you're not qualified. In other words, it's a death qualified jury. If you don't believe in the death penalty, you cannot be a juror, which is absurd, but it's the law. It
doesn't make sense to me.
No, but it's the law. Everywhere. And so my client was responsible for killing 13 people. And I used to say, because I saved him from the death penalty, I was looking for a jury who believed in the death penalty, but only for 14 or more.
Wow.
But what happened is, the anecdote in that trial is the courtroom was packed with 100, 150 potential jurors. There was a guy sitting in the back of the jury room, but I clearly did not want anything to do with. He was wearing a Winchester Arms belt buckle and some kind of a duck hunting hat, and just a real redneck sort of looking guy. And we were voir diring for a few days, talking about very sensitive issues, life and death, all kinds of things. And all of a sudden, his number was called. So he was in the box. So I went, oh my God, you know, what am I going to do with this guy? So the prosecutors thought they'd had their man. So they didn't ask any questions other than, how many kids do you have and what kind of truck do you drive? And there was clearly something wrong with him. And he was right in the front of the jury box. And I just walked up to him, and he was a little bit like you, actually, except with the hat on and everything. And I walked up to him and I said, what's the matter? And he started crying. And he said, I've sat here for 3 days, listened to all this. I've always believed in the death penalty. I own weapons. I'm an MRA member, but I realized I could never put that young man to death. So the bad news is we lost him as a juror because he was saying he wasn't death qualified. Ugh. But all the rest of the jury heard it all. So that was an example of how you don't boilerplate anything you do.
Right. So talk to that issue with respect to, I've interviewed a number of criminal defense lawyers, and so you represented Ted Bundy. You represented some other folks that were notorious in the news, etc. How do you do that as a person? You know, just somebody watching this and understanding how you as a lawyer can actually do that. Represent somebody that you know has killed people.
I lost the love of my life to a murderer in 1971. And I was in law school in DC and she was in graduate school in Berkeley. And somebody murdered her. And it has never been solved. And for a while, I became a believer in the death penalty and wanted to rip this person apart if I could find him. And it may sound a little bit woo-woo, but when I was in Chicago in graduate school, I had this very profound dream where her name was Debbie, and she came to me in this dream and said, don't honor me by believing in things that I don't believe in. And it was very, and I don't have that many powerful dreams. And so it changed my whole perspective and wanted to do what she wanted to do, which was abolish the death penalty, basically, even though she was a victim and even though I was a victim. So it's my situation is, I think, very unusual compared to many other defense lawyers, because I've also been a victim as well as an advocate.
And so, one of the things we talked about was, the first thing that the founders did was enshrine the right to a jury in the Bill of Rights, and then enshrined it into our Constitution. And, that's as part of our heritage. And one of the things as a defense lawyer is that you're doing your job to make sure that the state has proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that they don't overcharge and they don't load up a bunch of different things that are unrelated and put somebody away for something that perhaps they're innocent of or have overreached.
Well, it happens all the time. We, in federal court particularly, and more so under Attorney General Barr, who is an embarrassment to the whole legal profession, in my opinion. I know U.S. attorneys, prosecutors who have quit being U.S. attorneys and prosecutors since Trump was elected because they didn't want to work for him and they didn't want to work for Barr. But you see overcharging all the time. If you don't plead guilty, we're going to add 20 charges. Sometimes it gets so unethical, in my opinion, that they'll say, if there's a husband and a wife charged with an offense of, let's say, money laundering, and they'll say, well, if you don't both plead guilty, then nobody can plead guilty, which in my opinion is unethical. So we see an overreaching of the government now more than we have ever seen before. My job is harder than ever before. I go to law schools and talk people out of doing this job, unless it's their path. Being a private criminal defense attorney is a dying breed, because most are now county employees or government employees, which takes away a great deal of independence. I recently told a judge in a trial, believe it or not, that she was a particularly bad judge and she made some particularly bad rulings. And I said to her point blank, on the record, to her face, I will not follow that order. I knew I'd be held in contempt. She did hold me in contempt. And then she went back into her chambers and rubbed her head a lot and came out and realized that I was right. And so changed her mind. But at least I was willing enough to do that, which I think a lot of government employees are not allowed to do or wouldn't do. I told a judge about 7 or 8 years ago, a sitting judge, that he had dementia. And
how'd that go over?
Oh, not well. He held me in contempt. The interesting thing about that case, he held me, and I probably would have been disciplined severely by the bar, but clearly he had dementia, and it was a smaller county where there are only 4 or 5 judges. And one of the interesting things, and I was the bad boy, this case was not getting any publicity, it was a little case, but as soon as I called the judge, said he had dementia, then the newspapers picked up, and the TV picked up on it, and I became the bad boy for calling this, and he was African-American too, which didn't help. So I was calling this beloved African-American judge demented, and a month later he died from a brain aneurysm. So then I became the hero, because if he had followed my instructions, which was to go get an exam, he probably would have survived. But at least every defense lawyer I talked to and asked, what do I do if I'm stuck with a judge in a trial where my client might likely be innocent, who is demented every defense lawyer I talked to, including some fairly famous people you probably know about, all said there's nothing you can do about it. And then I talked to a conservative ethics professor at the University of Washington Law School, who's an expert on ethics, and he said, no, you have to stop the trial no matter whatever you do.
Right, right. So you were hired by Ted Bundy 3 years out of law school, is that right?
Yes.
So was I guess, you know, one of the things I like to ask folks is, what was one of the most defining moments in your career? Was that it, or was there other, I mean,
Well,
but what was for you, what was one of the most defining moments in your career as a
there's been so many of those. I mean, telling a judge he has dementia, sitting the judge is pretty defining. Bundy, you know, I was somebody who helps you with your podcast who communicated with me. I can't remember their name.
Sidney Bettino. So yeah, Sidney Bettino and Ashley Zurich have been great producers of this. They are unbelievable.
All right. Are they? That's a female.
Yeah. So Sidney and Ashley are they're going to law school this year.
She told me that she'd watched. I've done a number of television things, and sometimes I like to do them, sometimes I don't like to do them. I turned down the Netflix did a movie with Zac Efron about Bundy, and they wanted me to be in that as a major character, and I turned it down because I was a major character in Ted's travels. And then Netflix asked me to host the series they did on it, and I said no, and I could have used the money. But I was tired of the Bundy binge.
Sure.
And so then the Oxygen came along and did this really interesting show about, which you should really watch probably, is 4 lawyers who are very well known for representing some very difficult individuals. How did it feel to represent them? And so that was a great idea for a show. So I did that, and your assistant watched it. And that's how you got to me, I think. But I'd rather not be known as Ted Bundy's lawyer. And and we were on the Today Show, I think, and one of the other lawyers said, well, it's too late. Because, you know, I represented, at the same time I was representing Ted Bundy, I was making law nationally for battered women, which I'm much more proud of than probably anything I've ever done. I helped establish as a defense to a criminal offense, the battered women syndrome.
Wow,
so,
what case was that?
Huh?
What case was that?
Oh, it was Claudia Thacker and Ivy Kelly, and they're very well known, Kelly in particular. So it confuses people because, you know, at the same time I'm representing Ted Bundy, I'm asked by the National Women's Lawyer Project to work on battered women's cases, which is odd, just like also being the victim of a crime and losing the love of my life to a murderer representing murderers. I don't know. It's just my path. But I'd much rather not be known for representing Ted Bundy, but it's too late. So it was a defining point in my career to the extent that I became very well known as a result of it. I saved his life. I got a plea bargain to save his life, which is recounted in the book, which you need to read. It's an easy read. You can read it in 2 hours. You said you like to read. Anyway, I got a deal for Ted to save his life. And it's recounted in the book. Millard Farmer, who was a famous lawyer from Atlanta, helped me with it. And we were basically depriving Ted of sleep and food and other matters just to get him to sign the paperwork to plea. And as we were walking in the court the next day in Tallahassee, Millard was in front of Ted. I was then Ted, and then me. Ted turned around and said, I'm not going to do it. So that was the last time I tried to help Ted, actually. I remember Miller and I went back in the holding cell, and Miller had this wonderful Southern accent, and a real skinny little guy, looked like Ichabod Crane. Brilliant lawyer, wonderful man, wealthy, personally wealthy, so he spent his money and time doing nothing but death penalty cases. Fascinating for you to interview. I think he's still alive. But Miller put his skinny leg up on the bunk in the holding cell, and it said, Ted, John Henry and I, we only have X amount of time in this life, and we want to spend on people that want to live. Bye. That I did go to the Florida trial because I was subpoenaed as a witness. That's another long story that's in the book. But I didn't, despite his requests for me to help him further in his appeals and other matters, I declined. You know, once I saved somebody's life, and somebody like Ted Bundy, people don't even realize that it was possible to get a plea bargain for Ted Bundy, but I did.
Yeah. So I took a look at the letters that he wrote to you, and I'm blown away by the letters.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the letters he wrote to you are pretty amazing, and the whole story is amazing. So, but listen, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. I know that you want to escape Pioneer Place there and go down to Mexico. I hope this coronavirus thing gets done, and you're able to get back.
Well, I've got seven trials set for the next 9 months. So,
in Seattle?
No, all over the place.
Wow. So, well, I hope our paths cross. I mean, it'd really be nice to sit down and have a cup of coffee with a guy that his dad was a nuclear physicist and a G-man. His mom was originally from Norway, and he's living the American dream, being the.
And I haven't even told you the best part yet. Jackson Browne is my cousin.
He's your cousin?
Yeah.
Wow.
And,
so
we become friendly in the last 4 or 5 years. We've become quite friendly, and quite friendly. You know, he contracted the virus.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he was very serious condition in the hospital, but he's survived and he's back home now. But you know, he's a true poet, and you know, music has been a savior of my life, actually. And then when my dad figured out that he's in one time, my dad was into genealogy, and he came in one day and he said, you know this Jackson Browne character? I went, yeah, he's like one of my favorite musicians ever. He says, well, he's your third cousin. So Jackson and I become quite close.
Where does he live? Does he live in California?
He has a beautiful cabin in Big Sur that's off the grid, and he has a beautiful ranch in Southern California that's completely off the grid. He generates his own power. He has his own well. He lives the life he thinks he should.
Yeah,
he's a wonderful man, and he's terribly shy, but he's a genius in my opinion, and I'm so happy he's making it, and feel very blessed that he's making it through this.
Are you still able to ski?
Yes, I've had to put off a knee operation because of no elective operations.
Sure.
So I've been, it's been 3 months now since it's been scheduled. But once, and I skied last year, but see, on my 40th birthday, I climbed Mount Whitney, which is the highest mountain in the United States. And I didn't train for it at all. And so on the way down, I really destroyed my knees. And I'm also 6'6", and when you're tall, you have problems with your knees. And so I probably can't ski anymore or ride my motorcycle until I get my knee fixed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good luck with that, and I'm hopeful that this this whole thing. I don't know when we're going to get going again. When do you think they're going to be able to put 12 people in a box for a jury trial again?
I would say optimistically June.
Really? Yeah. I thought it'd be a little bit longer than that, just because.
Yeah, well, I said optimistically.
Yeah. No, I get it. I mean, that's what we do. We do trials and by jury, and here at the Daily Center, it's going to be hard to figure out logistically how to convince 12 people to actually, show up and be in a small room with 1,100 people.
Well, yeah, that's another problem too. I mean, it's gotten worse and worse. I mean, I had a case last year, one of the better cases I've ever had, a young Black man. I lost a lot of money. I mean, I do so much pro bono work. People think I make a lot of money and I, don't. But, I represented Sgt Bales for free, and I flew to Afghanistan twice and all that. And I represented Colton Harris Moore, the Barefoot Bandit, for free. But last year I had a really good defense case for a young Black man that was wrongfully accused, and I lost money on it. But there were 127 jurors called as potential witness jurors, one Black person. I know, and you just sit there and go,
where was that at?
Huh? It was in Seattle. It was in Seattle.
In Seattle.
Yep. And it's just the nature of picking voter registration and driver's license. A lot of African Americans, and certainly a lot of people who are not documented, don't have those documents. But it was outrageous. We ended up getting a hung jury, and then we made a deal. But still, 127 jurors. I mean, how would you like to wake up in the courtroom and you're the only white person in the courtroom?
No, I get it. Listen, man, I get it, and thank God. There's one thing that I'm really thrilled that you took the time to spend with us, and so people can understand that it's really important that in our constitutional system to have folks that are really good defending people that are charged with crimes, and because it's the worst thing in the world to prosecute and to convict an innocent person, and let overcharging take place as well.
Hey, you want to hear an amazing statistic to end this with, which would be good?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's two things. When the book became popular and I was giving talk shows and stuff, I decided to make some use out of it. And I said two things I wanted to concentrate on. The federal government's Department of Justice estimates that 5% of the people that are in prison are innocent. In Washington State, that's 900 people. Okay? And then the other thing was about the lack of mental health help for people in general. Every one of the school shootings involved a person with mental illness. Now, I'm not talking about the crazies with the M16s who shot up Las Vegas. I'm talking about the school shooters. Every single one of those school shooters had mental health problems. And yet we blame the gun. I'm not a gun nut, by the way, but I'm not an anti-gun nut either. But a gun is a tool.
Right.
But people should be able to, I think half a year of junior high school in the 9th grade should be taught mental health classes. How do you identify mental health problems in yourself? How do you define mental health problems in other people? And because every single school shooter was mentally ill, and 5% of the people in our prison system are innocent. In Washington State, that's 900 people, which is an outrage.
It is total outrage. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, John Henry. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Hey, take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Say hi to the big statue of the lion.
I will. Well, the Picasso.
Yes. All right.
All right, take care. Want to learn more about John Henry Browne and some of the high-profile clients he's represented? You can find his book, The Devil's Defender, on Amazon. Thanks for tuning in to episode 7 of The Opening Statement with Joe Shannon.